Two wild bobcats sat motionless in the grass, their desperate cries piercing the morning air as they refused to flee from the approaching human. In the mud pit behind them, their cub was drowning, and Michael Torres had minutes to decide if he would crawl within their killing range to pull it free. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The spring morning air hung heavy with moisture as the sun climbed over the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, its warm rays beginning to evaporate the previous night's rainfall. In a remote stretch of grassland bordered by dense woodland, where human presence was rare and nature reigned supreme, a desperate drama was unfolding that would test the boundaries between wild instinct and the capacity for trust. Two adult bobcats, their spotted coats gleaming in the early light, sat motionless on a patch of green grass, their bodies rigid with tension and their voices carrying across the meadow in cries that spoke of anguish no animal should have to endure. They were not hunting, not marking territory, not engaging in any of the behaviors that typically defined their solitary existence. Instead, they were calling for help in the only way they knew how, their golden eyes fixed on something that had shattered their world in an instant. Deep in the earth, approximately 8 feet from where the parent bobcats maintained their vigil, a small, muddy crater held their worst nightmare. The abandoned excavation, likely dug weeks earlier by a contractor and forgotten when the project was canceled, had filled with rainwater and transformed into a treacherous mud pit. Its edges were deceptively stable, covered with a thin layer of grass that disguised the danger beneath, and its center was a churning mixture of clay-rich soil and standing water that had become as deadly as quicksand. Trapped in this earthen prison was a bobcat cub, no more than 3 months old, its small body caked in thick brown mud that weighed down its normally agile frame. The youngster had ventured too close to the edge during the family's morning exploration, and the ground had given way beneath its tiny paws, plunging it into the cold, sucking mire below. The cub's exhausted attempts to climb free had only made things worse, each struggle driving it deeper into the mud's relentless grip. Its spotted coat, usually so beautiful and distinctive, was now completely obscured by layers of wet earth, and its small muzzle barely remained above the surface of the thick sludge. The kitten's eyes, wide with terror and fatigue, occasionally caught glimpses of its parents above, but its cries had weakened to pitiful mewls as hypothermia and exhaustion began to take their toll. How long the cub had been trapped was impossible to determine, but the mud caked around its body suggested it had been hours at minimum, perhaps since before dawn when the family had been traveling through the area. The adult bobcats had tried everything their instincts suggested. The female, larger and more aggressive in her desperation, had attempted multiple times to descend into the pit, only to find herself beginning to sink into the unstable edges. The male had circled the excavation repeatedly, seeking any angle that might offer a path to their offspring, but the pit's design was cruelly efficient in its trap. They had scratched at the edges, sending cascades of dirt into the hole that only worsened their cub's predicament. They had called and called, their vocalizations ranging from encouraging chirps to desperate yowls, trying to keep their baby alert and fighting. But as the morning progressed and their cub's movements became increasingly feeble, a terrible understanding had begun to dawn on them. They could not save their baby alone. This realization went against every survival instinct that had been bred into their species over millennia. Bobcats were solitary hunters, avoiding human contact at all costs, viewing people as the ultimate threat to be evaded rather than approached. Yet here they sat, their desperation overriding their natural wariness, making sounds they had never made before, hoping against evolutionary programming that somehow someone would understand and help. The female's distinctive facial markings, with their dark lines radiating from her eyes like tears, seemed particularly poignant as she lifted her head and released another mournful cry into the warming air. The male, slightly smaller but no less devoted, added his own voice to hers, creating a chorus of anguish that carried across the empty fields. Michael Torres had been driving these back roads for 15 years, ever since he had purchased his small farm property 3 miles from this very spot. At 47, he had seen plenty of wildlife during his daily commutes to his job as a county maintenance supervisor, from deer and foxes to the occasional black bear passing through the region. But he had never heard anything quite like the sound that suddenly penetrated his truck's cab as he drove past the overgrown access road that led to the abandoned construction site. The noise made him instinctively press the brake pedal, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to identify what he was hearing. It was not the sound of animals fighting, nor was it the territorial disputes he had heard before. This was something different, something that triggered a response deep in his chest that had nothing to do with training or experience, and everything to do with recognizing the universal language of distress. Michael pulled his truck onto the shoulder and killed the engine, stepping out into the morning air with the cautious movements of someone who had learned to respect the unpredictability of wild creatures. The sounds were clearer now, coming from somewhere beyond the tree line that bordered the old construction site. He knew this area well enough to remember the excavation project that had been started and abandoned the previous fall, something to do with a planned pipeline that never materialized after environmental concerns were raised. The company had supposedly filled in the holes, but Michael had his doubts about how thoroughly that had been done. As he made his way through the tall grass toward the source of the crying, his boots sinking slightly in the soft ground that still retained moisture from the night's rain, he found himself hoping he was wrong about what he might find. The sight that greeted him as he emerged into the clearing stopped him in his tracks. 2 bobcats, magnificent in their wild beauty despite their obvious distress, were positioned on a slight rise about 20 feet from where he stood. They noticed him immediately, and for a moment Michael expected them to bolt into the woods as any sensible wild animal would. Instead, they remained frozen in place, their eyes locked on him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. The female made a sound, not threatening but imploring, and the male echoed it. Then, in a gesture that defied everything Michael thought he knew about wildlife behavior, they both turned their heads to look at something behind them, then back at him, then at the spot again. Michael's heart began to race as understanding dawned on him. They were showing him something. Years of working outdoors, of observing animal behavior during his maintenance rounds, had taught him to read situations, but this was unprecedented. He took a careful step forward, watching the bobcats closely for any sign of aggression. When they did not retreat or attack, when instead they remained in their position and looked again toward whatever lay beyond the small rise, he found himself moving with cautious determination toward them. Every instinct screamed at him that approaching wild predators was dangerous, that bobcats could inflict serious injuries with their claws and teeth, that these were not domesticated creatures to be trusted. Yet something in their posture, in the desperate quality of their cries, told him that this situation transcended normal predator and prey relationships. As Michael crested the rise, staying a respectful distance from the adult bobcats, the full scope of the tragedy revealed itself. The excavation pit stretched before him, perhaps 10 feet across and roughly circular, its edges deceptively innocent-looking, with their covering of grass and weeds. But the center told a different story. The muddy water that filled the depression was darker than the surrounding soil, indicating significant depth, and its surface was disturbed in a way that suggested recent movement. Then he saw it, a small shape barely visible in the thick mud, and his breath caught in his throat. The bobcat cub was so covered in muck that it was almost indistinguishable from the surrounding earth, only the faint movement of its small head and the glint of its eyes revealing that it was still alive. Michael's mind raced through the implications of what he was seeing. The cub was trapped in what appeared to be several feet of mud, its body completely submerged except for its head and the very top of its back. The consistency of the mud, that terrible mixture of clay and water that characterized this region's soil after heavy rain, meant that every movement the kitten made would only exhaust it further without providing any purchase for escape. How long it had been there was impossible to determine, but the stillness of its body and the barely perceptible rise and fall of its breathing suggested it was near the end of its strength. Michael had seen animals trapped in mud before during his maintenance work, mostly deer and once a young calf that had wandered from a nearby farm, and he knew that time was the enemy in such situations. Exhaustion, hypothermia, and eventually drowning were the inevitable outcomes without intervention. He turned slowly to look at the adult bobcats, who had not moved from their position. The female was watching him with an intensity that was almost human in its expectation, while the male had his attention divided between Michael and the pit, as if unable to fully trust this human but desperate enough to hope. Michael had never believed those stories about wild animals seeking out human help, had always assumed they were exaggerations or misinterpretations of animal behavior. Yet here was proof that desperation could overcome even the most deeply ingrained survival instincts. These parent bobcats had clearly attempted their own rescue, evidenced by the scratch marks around the pit's edges and the disturbed earth where they had tried and failed to reach their baby. Now they were doing something that should have been impossible. They were trusting their ancient enemy to do what they could not. The weight of that trust settled on Michael's shoulders as he pulled out his cell phone to assess his options. The screen showed no signal, which was typical for this remote area, meaning he could not call for professional wildlife rescue or emergency services. He was on his own, which meant the responsibility for this young life rested entirely with him. Michael's maintenance work had taught him practical problem-solving skills, how to assess structural dangers, how to work with equipment and physics to accomplish difficult tasks. But this was different. This was not about fixing a drainage problem or clearing a blocked culvert. This was about saving a life while not getting killed by protective parent predators in the process, and doing it quickly before the cub's remaining strength gave out entirely. He walked carefully around the perimeter of the pit, studying its structure and trying to formulate a plan. The excavation was roughly 8 feet deep, based on the visible walls, and the mud that filled it appeared to be at least 3 to 4 feet deep, possibly more. The cub was positioned almost exactly in the center, meaning any rescue attempt would require reaching at least 4 feet from the edge, while dealing with unstable footing and the risk of falling in himself. Michael was a solidly built man, just over 6 feet tall and carrying the muscular weight that came from years of physical labor. But he knew that even his strength would mean nothing if he ended up trapped in that mud alongside the cub. He needed tools, leverage, and most critically, he needed to avoid spooking the adult bobcats into either fleeing or attacking. Michael jogged back to his truck, his mind cataloging what he had in his vehicle that might be useful. His job meant he carried a variety of equipment, some of which might serve this unexpected purpose. He grabbed a coil of nylon rope from behind the driver's seat, a wooden ladder that he had been transporting to repair a barn roof, several old towels he kept for cleaning up spills, and a heavy-duty tarp. He also retrieved his work gloves, knowing that handling a frightened wild animal, even a small one, without hand protection would be foolish. As an afterthought, he grabbed a couple of protein bars from his lunchbox, thinking that the exhausted cub might need food if they could get it out alive. When he returned to the clearing, the adult bobcats were still in position, though they tracked his approach with wary eyes. Michael noticed that the female had moved slightly closer to the pit, close enough that her own safety was questionable, and he understood the terrible calculus happening in her mind. Every maternal instinct was screaming at her to rescue her baby, while her rational survival instincts warned her of the danger. The male remained on the higher ground, his position allowing him to watch both the pit and Michael, ready to defend his mate if this human proved to be a threat rather than a savior. Moving slowly and deliberately, speaking in a low, calm voice that he hoped conveyed his intentions even if the bobcats could not understand his words, Michael began to set up his rescue operation. He positioned the ladder near the pit's edge, testing the ground carefully to ensure it would hold his weight without collapsing into the excavation. The wood felt solid beneath his hands as he extended it, and he was grateful that his habit of keeping quality equipment had left him with a sturdy 12-foot extension ladder rather than a cheaper alternative that might have failed under stress. He tied one end of the rope to the ladder's top rung, creating a safety line for himself, then secured the other end around a substantial oak tree that stood about 20 feet from the pit. The female bobcat made a low sound as Michael began to position the ladder, a vocalization that was neither threatening nor encouraging, but seemed to convey her heightened anxiety about his proximity to her trapped offspring. Michael paused, making eye contact with her briefly before continuing his work. He had learned during his years working outdoors that sudden movements and avoiding eye contact could trigger predatory instincts, while calm, deliberate actions and brief acknowledgement often put animals more at ease. It was a delicate balance, treating them with the respect they deserved as wild creatures, while also asserting enough confidence that they would not perceive him as either prey or a direct threat. With the ladder secured and his safety rope in place, Michael pulled on his work gloves and assessed his approach. The cub had not moved during his preparations, which worried him deeply. In his experience, trapped animals typically showed bursts of renewed energy when rescuers approached, a last desperate attempt to free themselves or a fear response to the arrival of what might be another predator. The kitten's stillness suggested it had progressed beyond that point, conserving its remaining strength simply to keep breathing. Michael estimated he had perhaps 30 minutes, maybe less, before hypothermia and exhaustion would claim the small life. The morning was warming, but the muddy water that imprisoned the cub had been cold all night, leaching away its body heat with relentless efficiency. He positioned one of the towels at the edge of the pit, creating a buffer between himself and the muddy rim, then began to carefully extend the ladder out over the excavation. The physics of the situation were challenging. He needed the ladder to reach far enough that he could access the cub, but not so far that it would become unstable or tip into the pit entirely. The wooden rungs creaked slightly under their own weight as the ladder cantilevered over the mud, and Michael found himself holding his breath as he calculated the angles. Behind him, he could hear the adult bobcats shifting position, their anxiety palpable in the small sounds they made as they watched this strange human doing something they could not fully comprehend. Once the ladder was positioned as well as he could manage, Michael tested it with gradually increasing weight, leaning onto it while keeping his feet planted firmly on solid ground. The structure held, though it flexed more than he would have liked. He would need to move quickly once he committed to the rescue, as the ladder's stability over the soft earth would decrease the longer weight was applied to it. Michael wrapped the safety rope around his waist, creating a crude harness that might prevent him from sliding completely into the pit if the worst happened. It was not ideal, but it was better than nothing, and time was a luxury this situation did not afford. Michael took a deep breath and began to carefully crawl out onto the ladder, distributing his weight as evenly as possible across multiple rungs. The wood bowed beneath him, and he felt the sickening shift of the earth at the pit's edge beginning to give way slightly. He froze, adjusting his position to transfer more weight back toward the solid ground. The female bobcat let out a sharp cry that made his heart jump, but when he glanced back at her, she was not looking at him but at her cub, and he realized she was calling to the kitten, trying to keep it alert and responsive. The male had moved closer, his powerful body tense as if preparing to spring, though whether to attack or flee Michael could not determine. Inch by careful inch, Michael worked his way out over the pit until he was suspended above the mud on the flexing ladder. Sweat ran down his face despite the cool morning air, a product of both physical exertion and the tension of knowing that one wrong move could send him plummeting into the same trap that held the cub. From this position, he could see the kitten more clearly, and what he saw broke his heart. The The small creature was barely recognizable as a bobcat, so thoroughly was it coated in thick mud. Only its eyes, wide and glazed with exhaustion, and the slight movement of its nostrils as it struggled to breathe confirmed it was still alive. The distance between his outstretched hand and the cub was still too great. Michael would need to extend himself even further, which meant committing more of his weight to the unsupported section of the ladder. He could feel the wooden structure beginning to sag more dramatically, could sense the earth at the pit's edge starting to crumble. There was no time for hesitation. Michael pushed himself forward, his hands leaving the security of the ladder rungs to reach down toward the trapped kitten. His fingers sank into the cold mud as he tried to get purchase on the small body beneath the muck. The moment his hands made contact with the cub, several things happened simultaneously. The kitten, responding to touch for the first time in hours, found some reserve of energy and began to struggle weakly. The movement caused Michael to lose his grip momentarily, and the ladder shifted dangerously as his weight distribution changed. Behind him, both adult bobcats vocalized loudly, the female's cry particularly piercing as she witnessed a stranger's hands on her baby. Michael's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears, but he forced himself to maintain focus. He could not afford to panic, could not allow the natural fear response to override his careful movements. He adjusted his grip, this time getting his hands beneath the cub's front legs and around its small chest. The kitten weighed almost nothing, its body size diminished by youth and now by the exhaustion of its ordeal. Michael began to lift, and immediately encountered resistance. The mud had created a suction effect around the cub's body, and simply pulling straight up would not work. He would need to break the seal that the thick clay had formed. Using one hand to support the cub's chest, Michael worked his other hand down along its body, trying to introduce air pockets that would release the mud's grip. The process seemed to take forever, though it was probably only seconds, and all the while the ladder continued its ominous flexing beneath him. Finally, with a sound like a grotesque kiss, the mud released its prisoner. Michael pulled the cub up and against his chest, cradling it as he began the precarious journey back along the ladder toward solid ground. The kitten made no sound, did not struggle, simply lay against him as if all its remaining energy had been spent in that final moment of liberation. Michael could feel its small heart beating rapidly against his chest, could sense the violent shivers that racked its tiny frame as its body tried desperately to generate warmth. Every movement back toward safety felt like it took an eternity, each shift of weight accompanied by the terrifying flex of the ladder and the sound of earth continuing to crumble at the pit's edge. When his feet finally touched solid ground again, Michael allowed himself one brief moment of relief before the next challenge presented itself. He was holding a wild bobcat cub, and somewhere very close behind him were two adult bobcats who had every reason to view him as either a threat or a competitor. The female had risen to her feet, her body language tense and uncertain, while the male had positioned himself slightly to her side, his golden eyes fixed on Michael and the bundle in his arms. This was the moment of truth, when the trust that desperation had created would either hold or shatter. Michael moved slowly, deliberately making his actions visible and non-threatening as he knelt on the ground with the mud-covered cub against his chest. The kitten was shivering violently, its small body racked with tremors that spoke of how close it had come to succumbing to hypothermia. He could feel the cold radiating from its mud-caked fur, could sense the weakness in its muscles as it lay limply in his arms. Time was still critical. Getting the cub out of the pit was only the first step. Now he needed to address the life-threatening cold that had seeped into its small body during its hours of imprisonment. The female bobcat took a tentative step forward, her movements careful and measured. She was close enough now that Michael could see the individual spots on her coat, could observe the way her whiskers twitched as she analyzed the situation. Her ears were forward rather than flattened, which Michael took as a positive sign, suggesting curiosity and concern rather than immediate aggression. She made a soft, chirping sound, different from her earlier desperate cries, and the cub in Michael's arms responded with a weak mewl that seemed to take all its remaining strength. That small sound appeared to make a decision for the mother. She sat down, her haunches settling onto the grass, and watched with intense focus as this human held her baby. Michael reached for one of the towels he had brought, keeping his movements slow and predictable. He began to gently wipe away the worst of the mud from the cub's face, clearing its nostrils and mouth to ensure it could breathe freely. The kitten's eyes, now more visible without their coating of muck, were a cloudy blue that would eventually change to the golden yellow of its parents. They blinked slowly at him, showing a level of trust that seemed impossible for a wild creature, but was perhaps simply the result of extreme exhaustion. As Michael worked, he kept up a steady stream of quiet conversation, his voice low and calm, talking to the cub, to the parents, to himself, creating a soothing background noise that seemed to ease the tension in the air. The male bobcat had moved closer as well, though he maintained a more conservative distance than his mate. His positioning was strategic, Michael noticed, allowing him to intervene quickly if needed while also providing a clear escape route. The intelligence in those golden eyes was remarkable, and Michael found himself wondering what thoughts were processing behind that fierce but calculating gaze. Was the male weighing the evidence of Michael's actions, seeing that the human was helping rather than harming? Or was he simply waiting, ready to attack the moment his family was threatened? There was no way to know for certain, but the fact that neither parent had fled or attacked suggested they were willing to give this unprecedented situation a chance to play out. Michael continued his careful cleaning of the cub, using multiple towels to wipe away the mud and then to gently rub the small body, trying to generate warmth through friction. The kitten was a male, he noted, probably around 3 months old based on his size and the development of his features. His spotted coat, where it showed through the remaining mud, was beautiful, the rosettes perfectly formed and distributed across his tawny fur, but beauty meant nothing if they could not get his core temperature up. The cub's shivers were beginning to subside, which could be either a good sign indicating he was warming up, or a terrible sign indicating he was progressing into the final stages of hypothermia, where the body simply gave up. Making a decision, Michael carefully wrapped the cub in the tarp, creating a burrito-like bundle that would help retain any body heat the kitten could generate. He tucked the wrapped cub against his chest, using his own body warmth to help the process. The adult bobcats watched this with obvious concern, the female rising to her feet again as her baby disappeared into the strange material. Michael spoke to her directly, his tone reassuring, even though he knew she could not understand his words. The meaning, he hoped, would come through in his tone and his gentle handling of her offspring. For several long minutes, they remained in this strange tableau. Michael kneeling on the ground with a bundled bobcat cub against his chest, 2 adult bobcats watching from a distance of perhaps 15 feet, and the morning sun climbing higher in the sky, warming the air and beginning to dry the muddy excavation that had nearly claimed a young life. Michael could feel the cub's heartbeat against his chest, rapid but growing stronger, and he took that as encouragement. The shivers had started again, which paradoxically was good news, indicating the body was actively trying to generate heat rather than shutting down. The female bobcat made another sound, this one almost conversational in tone, and then did something that made Michael's breath catch. She moved closer, closing the distance between them to perhaps 10 feet, then 8. She was well within striking range now, close enough that if she decided to attack, Michael would have no chance to defend himself. But her body language did not suggest aggression. Instead, she seemed to be assessing, studying, trying to understand what this human was doing to her baby and whether it was helping or hurting. Michael remained perfectly still, letting her approach on her own terms, his heart pounding, but his exterior calm. The female moved even closer, her movements graceful and silent, until she was near enough that Michael could have reached out and touched her if he had been foolish enough to try. She stretched her neck forward, her nose twitching as she scented the air around him and the bundle he held. Then, in a gesture that seemed to bridge the vast evolutionary distance between wild predator and human compassion, she sat down directly in front of him, her golden eyes meeting his in a moment of connection that transcended species. The male had also moved closer, positioning himself at an angle where he could see both his mate and the human. His body remained tense, ready for action, but like the female, he was watching rather than attacking, assessing rather than fleeing. Michael understood the magnitude of what was happening. These wild bobcats, creatures that should have been terrified of human contact, were instead choosing to stay, to trust, to wait and see if this strange bipedal creature could succeed where they had failed. Time passed in a blur of careful movement and watchful waiting. Michael continued to hold the cub, periodically checking on its condition through the tarp, monitoring its breathing and the strength of its heartbeat. The kitten seemed to be responding to the warmth, its shivers becoming less violent, its breathing more regular. After what Michael estimated was about 20 minutes, he carefully unwrapped the tarp to check on his patient more thoroughly. The cub's eyes were clearer now, more alert, and when Michael gently pressed on its abdomen to check for internal injuries, the kitten responded with a weak but definite squirm of protest. The moment the cub was visible again, both adult bobcats leaned forward, their attention laser-focused on their baby. The female made that chirping sound again, and the cub responded, its voice stronger than before. The communication between mother and baby was unmistakable, and Michael felt like an intruder on an intimate moment despite being the architect of their reunion. He knew what needed to happen next, knew that his role in this drama was coming to an end. The cub was warming up, was responding and alert, and while it would need food and further rest to fully recover, it was out of immediate danger. The question now was how to return the baby to its parents without triggering an attack or causing the family to scatter in fear. Michael carefully rewrapped the cub, leaving just its head exposed, and began to slowly stand. The movement caused both adult bobcats to tense, the male rising to his feet, and the female's ears flattening slightly. Michael froze, waiting for them to settle before continuing his slow rise to a standing position. He held the bundled cub close to his chest, feeling the small body's warmth through the tarp, evidence that their emergency warming efforts had been successful. The kitten was moving more now, squirming slightly in its wrapping, which Michael took as a positive sign. The return of energy meant the hypothermia had been arrested, though the cub would still be weak and would need nourishment soon. Michael's mind raced through his options. He could not simply walk toward the adult bobcats and hand over their baby as if this were some kind of civilized transaction. These were wild animals operating on instinct, and even their remarkable display of trust had limits that he dared not test. The female bobcat was watching his every movement with an intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Despite her earlier approach and the apparent truce that had developed between them, Michael understood that he was still dealing with a predator fully capable of inflicting serious injury if she perceived a threat to her offspring. The male had positioned himself in a way that would allow him to flank Michael if needed, his powerful shoulders bunched with tension, his tail twitching in a way that suggested barely contained energy. They were waiting to see what this human would do next, whether he would prove to be the savior their desperation had led them to trust, or whether he would reveal himself to be a threat after all. Michael took a slow, careful step backward, away from the bobcats, rather than toward them. The movement seemed to confuse them momentarily, their heads tilting slightly as they tried to understand why the human was increasing the distance. He took another step back, then another, creating space between himself and the parent cats. When he had retreated approximately 20 feet, far enough that the bobcats might feel less threatened but close enough that they could see their cub clearly, Michael knelt down again. He spoke softly, his voice carrying across the distance in a soothing tone that he hoped would communicate his intentions, even if the words themselves meant nothing to wild ears. Slowly, deliberately, Michael began to unwrap the tarp from around the cub. The kitten protested weakly, having found comfort in the warmth of the material, but Michael persisted until the small spotted body was fully visible. The cub was still covered in patches of drying mud, its fur standing up in spiky clumps, but it was undeniably alert and alive. Michael cradled it in his hands for a moment, supporting its weight from beneath, then carefully placed it on the grass in front of him. The kitten wobbled on unsteady legs, its muscles weak from the ordeal and from the hours of immobility in the cold mud, but it managed to remain upright. The moment the cub was on the ground, the female bobcat vocalized loudly, that same chirping call that Michael had heard before. The kitten's response was immediate, its small voice answering its mother's call with growing strength. The baby took a tentative step toward its parents, then another, its gait unsteady but determined. Michael remained perfectly still, scarcely daring to breathe as he watched the reunion he had made possible begin to unfold. The female was moving forward now, her earlier caution giving way to maternal instinct as she closed the distance to her baby in a few graceful bounds. What happened next would remain etched in Michael's memory for the rest of his life. The female bobcat reached her cub and immediately began to inspect it, her nose working over every inch of the small body, checking for injuries, and reassuring herself that her baby was truly alive and relatively unharmed. The cub leaned into her touch, making soft sounds of relief and need. Then the mother did something extraordinary. She looked up from her inspection, her golden eyes finding Michael's across the 20 feet of grass that separated them, and she held his gaze. It was a moment of acknowledgement, of understanding, of something that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild animal. Michael felt it in his core, that connection, that moment of shared purpose that had brought them together against all evolutionary programming. The male bobcat joined his family, his own inspection of the cub more cursory but no less intent. He positioned himself between the reunited mother and baby and Michael, a protective stance that made his role clear. He was the guardian, the defender, and while the crisis had passed and trust had been extended, he would not allow that trust to be betrayed. Michael understood and respected the message. He began to slowly gather his equipment, moving with deliberate care to avoid any sudden gestures that might be perceived as threatening. The ladder, the rope, the muddy towels, all the tools that had made the rescue possible, were collected with quiet efficiency. As Michael worked, he kept the bobcat family in his peripheral vision, aware that the situation could still turn dangerous if he made a wrong move. But the adult bobcat seemed focused on their cub, with the female now licking the remaining mud from its fur in a grooming behavior that was both practical and comforting. The kitten was responding to the attention, its small body relaxing into its mother's care in a way that spoke of relief and security. The male occasionally glanced toward Michael, tracking his movements, but showed no signs of aggression as long as the human maintained his distance and his non-threatening behavior. Michael loaded his equipment back onto his shoulder and began to walk slowly toward his truck, taking a wide arc that would keep him well away from the bobcat family. Each step felt surreal, as if he were moving through a dream rather than reality. The events of the past hour had challenged everything he thought he knew about wildlife behavior, about the rigid boundaries between human and animal, about the impossibility of communication across species lines. He had witnessed something that most people would never believe, had participated in a moment of trust so profound that it seemed to rewrite the rules of nature itself. As he reached the edge of the clearing, Michael paused and looked back one final time. The bobcat family was still there, the mother continuing her grooming of the cub while the male stood watch. But as Michael watched, the male turned and made eye contact with him again, and in that look, Michael swore he saw something that might have been gratitude or at least acknowledgement. The moment stretched between them, human and wild predator recognizing each other not as enemies or as master and subject, but as two beings who had worked together toward a common goal. Then the male turned away, lowering his head to nuzzle his cub, and Michael knew that his part in their story was complete. The walk back to his truck felt longer than the journey out had been, his legs suddenly heavy with the weight of adrenaline draining from his system. His hands were shaking as he loaded his equipment into the truck bed, the reality of what he had just done beginning to sink in. He had crawled out over a dangerous mud pit to rescue a wild bobcat cub while its parents watched. He had held a wild predator in his arms and warmed it back from the brink of hypothermia. He had been within striking distance of two adult bobcats who could have killed or seriously injured him, and instead of attacking, they had trusted him with their most precious possession. Michael climbed into his truck and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he processed the experience. His work clothes were covered in mud, his gloves were ruined, and he was going to be late to his job, but none of that seemed to matter. He had participated in something extraordinary, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of his life. As he started the engine and began the drive back to the main road, he found himself wondering if anyone would believe his story. Would his co-workers understand what had happened in that clearing? Would his family grasp the significance of the trust that had been extended and honored? Michael made it to work nearly an hour late, his appearance drawing immediate attention from his co-workers at the county maintenance facility. His supervisor, Tom Brennan, took one look at Michael's mud-covered clothes and the distant expression in his eyes and simply shook his head with a mixture of amusement and concern. Tom had worked with Michael for over a decade and had learned to expect the unexpected when it came to his employees' encounters with wildlife during fieldwork. But even by those standards, Michael's appearance suggested something remarkable had occurred. In the break room, over coffee that had grown bitter from sitting too long on the burner, Michael found himself telling the story to a small crowd of co-workers who had gathered to hear what adventure had delayed his arrival. He described the sounds that had drawn him to the clearing, the sight of the two adult bobcats seemingly asking for help, the terrifying crawl out over the mud pit to reach the trapped cub. As he spoke, Michael watched the reactions of his audience, saw the skepticism in some faces, the wonder in others, the outright disbelief in a few. He could not blame them. If someone had told him this story a day ago, he might not have believed it either. One of the younger maintenance workers, a man named Derek who prided himself on his hunting knowledge, spoke up with obvious doubt. "That is not how bobcats behave," he insisted. "They do not seek out humans for help. They do not stay close when people approach, and they certainly do not trust humans with their young. It goes against everything we know about predator behavior." Michael simply shrugged, having anticipated this reaction. He knew what he had witnessed, knew the truth of the experience in his bones, and whether others believed him or not, did not change the reality of what had occurred in that clearing. But Tom, who had known Michael long enough to trust his judgment and his honesty, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Do you think the cub will survive?" Michael considered this carefully before responding. The kitten had been in bad shape, weakened by exposure and exhaustion, but it had been alert when he left, responsive to its mother's care. Bobcats were resilient creatures, adapted to surviving in harsh conditions. If the cub could avoid infection from any injuries sustained in the pit, if it could warm up fully and get nourishment from its mother, then yes, Michael believed it had a good chance. The mother had seemed healthy and capable, and with both parents to provide for it, the young bobcat had everything it needed to recover. The rest of Michael's workday passed in a blur of routine tasks that seemed oddly mundane after the morning's extraordinary events. He repaired damaged road signs, cleared debris from drainage culverts, responded to complaints about potholes that needed filling. But his mind kept drifting back to that clearing, to the weight of the small cub in his arms, to the golden eyes of the mother bobcat looking at him with what he could only interpret as gratitude. The experience had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of the natural world, had shown him that the boundaries between species were perhaps more permeable than he had previously believed. That evening, after returning home and changing out of his ruined work clothes, Michael found himself unable to settle. His wife, Maria, listened to his account of the day with the patience of someone who had heard many wildlife stories over their 23 years of marriage, but even she seemed struck by the unusual nature of this particular encounter. She made him promise to drive back to the site the following day, to check on the bobcat family if possible, to ensure that the cub was continuing to recover. Michael had been thinking the same thing, though he knew he would need to be careful about his approach. The trust that desperation had created might not extend to a second encounter, and he had no wish to disturb the family or cause them to relocate because of human presence. The next morning, Michael woke before dawn, too restless to sleep. He made the drive back to the clearing in the pre-dawn darkness, parking his truck at the same spot as the previous day and making his way through the tall grass as the first light began to paint the eastern sky. The excavation pit remained as he had left it, though he noticed that the adult bobcats had clearly returned to the area after his departure. Fresh tracks marked the mud at the pit's edge, and he could see where they had investigated the site of their cub's imprisonment, perhaps trying to understand what had happened or simply marking the location in their memory. But of the bobcat family themselves, there was no sign. Michael had not really expected to see them. Bobcats were primarily crepuscular, most active during dawn and dusk, and they would have no reason to return to this spot now that the crisis had passed. Still, he found himself scanning the tree line, hoping for a glimpse of spotted fur or the distinctive tufted ears that marked the species. The forest remained silent, except for the morning calls of songbirds and the rustle of small mammals moving through the underbrush. Michael spent nearly an hour at the site, ostensibly checking to ensure the excavation pit posed no danger to other animals, but really just hoping for some sign that the cub had survived the night. He found nothing definitive, but the absence of evidence was perhaps evidence itself. If the cub had died, he reasoned, the parents would have likely stayed near the body or shown signs of distress. The fact that the area was quiet and undisturbed suggested the family had moved on, hopefully with all members healthy and recovering. Over the following days, Michael made several more visits to the clearing, always careful to minimize his presence and avoid disturbing any wildlife that might be in the area. He never saw the bobcat family again, though he occasionally found tracks that might have belonged to them, and once he heard a distant vocalization that could have been a bobcat call echoing through the forest. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Had the cub survived? Were they thriving somewhere in the vast forest, or had his rescue been for nothing, a temporary reprieve before nature claimed its due? 3 weeks after the rescue, Michael was conducting a routine survey of a different section of his work area when he encountered something that made his heart skip. Fresh bobcat tracks, 2 adults and 1 smaller set that could only belong to a juvenile. The tracks were several hours old but clear in the soft earth beside a stream. Michael followed them for perhaps 100 yards, careful not to disturb the trail, until they led to a sunny patch of forest where the ground showed signs of recent activity. Scratches on tree bark, scat deposits, and the flattened grass where animals had rested all pointed to bobcats having spent time in this location. Then he saw it, caught on a low branch, a small tuft of spotted fur that could only have come from a young bobcat. Michael carefully collected the fur, examining it in the morning light. It was clean and healthy looking, showing none of the stress indicators that would suggest illness or malnutrition. This was the fur of a thriving animal, one that was eating well and living successfully in the wild. Michael could not be absolutely certain that these tracks belonged to the family he had helped, but the timing was right. The location was within reasonable range of the rescue site, and the presence of a juvenile of approximately the right age seemed too coincidental to dismiss. He stood there in the forest, the small tuft of fur in his palm, and felt a weight lift from his chest that he had not fully acknowledged was there. He stood there in the forest, the small tuft of fur in his palm, and felt a weight lift from his chest that he had not fully acknowledged was there. The cub had survived. Somewhere in this vast woodland, a young bobcat was learning to hunt, to navigate its territory, to become the apex predator it was born to be. The rescue had not been in vain. The trust that had been extended between species on that desperate morning had resulted in a life saved, a family preserved, and Michael found himself blinking back unexpected tears at the realization. As spring progressed into early summer, Michael's routine fieldwork took him through various sections of the forest, and he began to notice signs of bobcat presence with increasing frequency. Scratch marks on trees, scat deposits along game trails, and the occasional track in soft earth all spoke of a healthy bobcat population moving through the area. He could not know for certain which signs belonged to the family he had helped, but he liked to think that at least some of them did. The forest had absorbed their story, had taken that moment of crisis and resolution and woven it back into the natural tapestry of life and death, predator and prey, survival and adaptation. Word of Michael's rescue had spread through the small community despite his attempts to downplay the incident. The local newspaper had somehow gotten wind of the story, perhaps through one of his co-workers, and a reporter had called requesting an interview. Michael had reluctantly agreed, thinking that perhaps sharing the experience might help others understand the complexity of wildlife behavior and the capacity for trust that could exist between humans and wild animals. The article that appeared the following week was surprisingly well written, treating the incident with respect rather than sensationalism, focusing on the unusual behavior of the bobcats and the quick thinking that had saved the cub's life. The publication of the article brought unexpected consequences. Michael began receiving calls from people who wanted to share their own wildlife encounters, some remarkable, others clearly exaggerated or misinterpreted. A local elementary school invited him to speak to their students about wildlife safety and conservation, an invitation he accepted with some trepidation, but ultimately found rewarding. Standing before a classroom of wide-eyed children, showing them photos of bobcat tracks and explaining how to respect wildlife while appreciating it from a safe distance, Michael felt a sense of purpose he had not anticipated. Perhaps his experience could serve a larger goal, helping to foster a new generation's understanding and appreciation for the wild creatures that shared their landscape. One call stood out from the others. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife biologist from the State University, contacted Michael to discuss the incident in detail. She was particularly interested in the behavioral aspects of the adult bobcat's actions, their apparent communication of need to a human, and their tolerance of human proximity during the rescue. Over coffee at a local diner, Dr. Walsh explained that such behavior, while not unheard of, was rare enough to warrant documentation and study. She asked Michael's permission to include the incident in a research paper she was preparing on adaptive behavior in wild felids, emphasizing the importance of understanding how wildlife might respond to human presence in crisis situations. Michael agreed, though he felt somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of his experience becoming academic material. Dr. Walsh assured him that his identity would be protected if he wished, but Michael decided that transparency was more important than anonymity. If his story could contribute to scientific understanding of wildlife behavior, then he was willing to be associated with it publicly. The conversation with Dr. Walsh also provided him with a deeper appreciation for what he had witnessed. She explained that the bobcat's behavior suggested a level of cognitive flexibility that challenged some assumptions about wild animal intelligence and adaptability. The ability to override deeply ingrained survival instincts, to assess a human as a potential helper rather than a threat, and to communicate that need effectively spoke to a complexity of thought that deserved serious study. As summer deepened and the forest grew lush with vegetation, Michael found himself thinking less frequently about the rescue, the immediate emotional impact beginning to fade into a cherished memory rather than a constant preoccupation. His work continued as always, the cycles of maintenance and repair that kept the county's infrastructure functional, but something had changed in how he approached his job. He found himself more attentive to the wildlife around him, more aware of the ways in which human infrastructure intersected with animal habitat, more conscious of the impact that seemingly minor decisions could have on the creatures that lived in and around developed areas. He began documenting wildlife sightings during his field work, keeping a detailed log of tracks, scat, and direct observations. The project started as a personal interest but gradually evolved into something more systematic. Michael consulted with Dr. Walsh about proper documentation methods, learned to use a trail camera he purchased with his own money, and began to build a comprehensive picture of wildlife movement patterns in his work area. The data he collected, while far from scientific in its rigor, proved useful to local conservation efforts, and the county eventually provided him with better equipment and official support for what had become an informal wildlife monitoring program. 6 months after the rescue, in the early chill of autumn, Michael was checking one of his trail cameras when he captured something extraordinary. The camera, positioned along a game trail that showed regular use by various species, had been triggered by movement in the early morning hours. As Michael scrolled through the images on the camera's small screen, his breath caught. 3 bobcats had passed within view of the lens, 2 adults and a juvenile that was approaching adult size but still showed the slightly gangly proportions of youth. The image quality was not perfect, the low light of dawn creating some grain, but the basic features were clear enough to see. Michael downloaded the images to his laptop when he returned to his truck, enhancing them as much as the software would allow. He studied the spotted patterns on the bobcats' coats, the distinctive facial markings, the way they moved through the frame. Could this be them? The family he had helped? The timing was right for the cub to have reached this size. The location was within the range where he had found the tracks and fur tuft months earlier, but Michael knew he could not be certain. Bobcats were not uncommon in this region, and without individual identification markers, there was no way to definitively prove these were the same animals. Still, as he looked at the image of the 3 bobcats moving confidently through their territory, Michael allowed himself to believe. He wanted to think that the small, mud-covered kitten he had pulled from that pit had grown into this healthy juvenile, that the desperate parents who had trusted him with their most precious possession had succeeded in raising their baby to independence. Whether or not it was true in a literal sense, it was true in the way that mattered most. Somewhere in this forest, the family he had helped was thriving, or if not that specific family, then others like them, benefiting from the habitat protection and conservation efforts that incidents like his rescue had helped to strengthen. The trail camera photograph became something of a local sensation after Michael shared it with Dr. Walsh, who in turn presented it at a regional wildlife conference as part of her ongoing research into adaptive behavior in wild felids. The image, while not definitive proof of the rescued cub's survival, served as a powerful symbol of the resilience of wildlife when given a chance. It sparked conversations about the role of human intervention in wildlife crises, the ethics of helping versus allowing nature to take its course, and the unexpected ways in which wild animals might communicate need to humans when desperate circumstances demanded it. Michael found himself invited to speak at various venues, from school classrooms to conservation society meetings, always telling the story with humility and emphasizing that he had simply been in the right place at the right time. He stressed that his actions should not be seen as a template for wildlife interaction. Approaching wild predators was dangerous, he would remind his audiences, and the circumstances of that morning had been unique in ways that might never be repeated. The Bobcat's behavior had been driven by desperation, and their trust had been a gift he did not take lightly. Others should not seek out such encounters or assume that wild animals would respond similarly in different situations, but despite these caveats, Michael's story had an undeniable impact on how people in his community viewed wildlife. Reports of nuisance bobcat complaints decreased as residents became more understanding of the animal's behavior and needs. When a bobcat was spotted near a suburban neighborhood that following winter, instead of immediate calls for removal, residents contacted the local wildlife authorities for guidance on coexistence strategies. The shift was subtle but meaningful, a move from viewing bobcats as threats to be eliminated towards seeing them as valuable parts of the ecosystem that deserve protection and respect. The excavation pit that had nearly claimed the cub's life became a focal point for Michael's advocacy work. He partnered with local construction companies and county officials to develop better protocols for securing abandoned work sites. The regulations that emerged from these discussions required contractors to fence off deep excavations, fill them within specific time frames, or cover them with materials that would prevent animals from becoming trapped. It was a practical legacy of the rescue, one that would potentially save countless animals from similar fates in the years to come. Michael also worked with Dr. Walsh and her team to install additional trail cameras throughout the region, creating a more comprehensive monitoring system that tracked not just bobcats, but the entire spectrum of wildlife moving through the area. The data they collected revealed patterns of animal movement that informed conservation planning, helped identify critical habitat corridors, and provided early warning of population changes that might indicate environmental problems. What had started as one man's desire to know if a rescued cub had survived had evolved into a citizen science project that contributed meaningfully to regional wildlife management. As winter approached again, marking nearly a year since the rescue, Michael received an unexpected call from a ranger in a state park approximately 15 miles from the original rescue site. The ranger, who had read Dr. Walsh's research paper and recognized the connection to Michael's story, had captured trail camera footage that he thought Michael would want to see. When Michael drove to the park office and viewed the video, his eyes widened with recognition and wonder. The footage showed a female bobcat with 2 cubs of her own, teaching them to hunt along a stream bank. While the quality was not perfect and positive identification was impossible, something about the way the female moved, the distinctive pattern of spots along her shoulder, reminded Michael powerfully of the mother bobcat he had encountered that desperate morning. If this was indeed the same female, then the story had come full circle in a way that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The cub that had been rescued had survived to adulthood, had found a mate, and was now raising the next generation. The ranger explained that this female had been seen regularly in the park over the past several months, demonstrating excellent hunting skills and showing no fear of the areas near hiking trails, though she maintained appropriate distance from humans. Her confidence suggested an animal that had learned early in life that humans, while to be respected and avoided in most circumstances, were not automatic threats. Michael watched the video multiple times, studying every detail, trying to find definitive proof that this was the family he had helped. But nature rarely provided such neat conclusions. The truth was, he would never know with absolute certainty whether the cub he pulled from that mud pit had grown to become this successful mother, teaching her own offspring the skills they would need to thrive in a world increasingly shaped by human presence. But the possibility was enough. The hope was enough. The knowledge that his actions that morning might have contributed to this thriving lineage filled him with a sense of purpose and connection to the natural world that he had never experienced before. Dr. Walsh used the new footage in her presentations, always careful to note that while the connection could not be proven, the timeline and location made it plausible. She emphasized that this was what successful wildlife conservation looked like, Not grand gestures or massive interventions, but individual moments of compassion and quick thinking that allowed nature to continue its work. The bobcat population in the region was stable and healthy, fulfilling its ecological role as a mid-level predator that helped control rodent and rabbit populations, which in turn affected vegetation patterns and the overall health of the ecosystem. The story began to attract attention beyond the local area. A documentary filmmaker contacted Michael about featuring his experience in a series about human-wildlife interactions, and while he was initially reluctant about the publicity, he agreed when he learned that the project would also highlight the conservation work that had grown from the rescue. The filming process was more involved than Michael had anticipated, with the crew spending days capturing footage of the forest, interviewing Dr. Walsh and other experts, and recreating elements of the rescue for visual storytelling purposes. When the documentary aired on a national nature channel the following spring, Michael watched it with his family gathered around the television. Seeing his experience translated into polished footage with dramatic music and professional narration felt surreal, almost as if it had happened to someone else. But the core message came through clearly, that moments of connection between humans and wildlife were possible, that trust could bridge even the widest evolutionary divides, and that individual actions mattered in the larger context of conservation and coexistence. The response to the documentary was overwhelming. Michael's email inbox filled with messages from people sharing their own wildlife encounters, asking questions about bobcat behavior, expressing gratitude that someone had taken the time to help a wild animal in need. Some messages were from children who had been inspired to learn more about wildlife conservation, others from adults who had been moved to support local conservation organizations or change their own behaviors to be more wildlife-friendly. The ripple effects of that single morning continued to expand in ways Michael could never have anticipated. 2 years after the rescue, Michael found himself standing once again at the edge of the clearing where it had all begun. The excavation pit had been properly filled and graded, the dangerous trap eliminated as part of the new protocols his advocacy had helped establish. Native grasses and wildflowers had reclaimed the disturbed earth, and if someone did not know the history of this spot, they would never guess that a life-or-death drama had played out here. Nature had a way of healing its scars, of absorbing human intrusions and transforming them back into wilderness, given enough time and opportunity. Michael had brought Dr. Walsh with him on this visit, along with a small film crew documenting a follow-up segment for the Nature Channel. They wanted to capture his reflections on the anniversary and to update viewers on the conservation work that had grown from that single morning's events. But mostly, Michael had come for personal reasons, to reconnect with the place that had changed his understanding of the relationship between humans and the wild creatures that shared their world. As he stood there in the warm spring sunshine, listening to the birds calling from the surrounding trees and watching butterflies dance among the wildflowers, he felt a profound sense of peace. Dr. Walsh had brought impressive news to share during the visit. Her research on adaptive behavior in bobcats, which had grown significantly since that initial conversation over coffee, had attracted funding from a major conservation foundation. The grant would support expanded monitoring of bobcat populations across multiple states, studying not just their numbers and movements, but their behavioral flexibility and their ability to adapt to landscapes increasingly modified by human activity. Michael's rescue had served as a catalyst for this research, demonstrating that wild predators possessed cognitive abilities and behavioral plasticity that deserved serious scientific attention. The data they had collected over the past 2 years painted a hopeful picture. The bobcat population in the region was not just stable but growing slightly, with successful reproduction documented across multiple family groups. The trail camera network that had started as Michael's personal project had expanded to include dozens of volunteers, monitoring hundreds of cameras across the county. The images and videos they captured provided unprecedented insights into bobcat behavior, movement patterns, and habitat use. This information had proven invaluable for land use planning, helping to ensure that development projects incorporated wildlife corridors and protected critical habitat areas. One particular finding had emerged that vindicated Michael's decision to intervene that morning. Analysis of the trail camera data showed that juvenile bobcats faced a mortality rate of approximately 60% in their first year of life, with causes ranging from starvation and predation to accidents and disease. Every cub that survived that vulnerable first year represented a significant contribution to the population's health and genetic diversity. The cub Michael had pulled from the mud pit, whether or not it was the same individual now documented raising its own young, had beaten those odds in part because a human had chosen to help rather than to turn away. The film crew captured Michael's interview in the reclaimed clearing, his words measured and thoughtful as he reflected on what the experience had taught him. He spoke about the moment when he had first seen the adult bobcats and realized they were asking for help, about the terror of crawling out over that mud pit knowing he could fall in himself, about the weight of the small, cold cub in his arms and the fierce determination to see it survive. But he also spoke about the larger lessons, about the importance of paying attention to the world around us, about the capacity for trust that could exist between species when desperation demanded it, about the responsibility that came with being the dominant species on a planet we shared with countless others. When the interview concluded and the film crew began packing their equipment, Michael walked the perimeter of the former excavation one more time. Dr. Walsh joined him, and they stood together in companionable silence, two people whose lives had been unexpectedly intertwined by the crisis of a small wild animal. She shared with him that she had been invited to present their research findings at an international wildlife conference, where the bobcat rescue story would serve as a case study in human-wildlife interaction and conservation success. The invitation represented recognition that their work mattered beyond local boundaries, that the lessons learned here could inform wildlife management practices across continents. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Michael noticed fresh tracks in the soft earth near the tree line. Bobcat tracks, clearly recent, the paw prints sharp and well-defined. Dr. Walsh knelt to examine them, her trained eye reading the signs with practiced ease. She looked up at Michael with a smile. A female and at least one juvenile, she reported. They passed through here within the last few hours, probably heading toward the creek to hunt. The presence of bobcats returning to this spot, reclaiming it as part of their territory after the danger had been eliminated, felt somehow appropriate, a validation of everything they had worked toward. Michael's work with wildlife monitoring had expanded his role within the county maintenance department. His supervisor, Tom, had recognized the value of having an employee who understood how infrastructure projects affected wildlife and could help design solutions that minimized negative impacts. Michael now served as a liaison between maintenance operations and the county's Environmental Services Division, reviewing project plans to identify potential conflicts with wildlife habitat and suggesting mitigation strategies. It was not a glamorous role, but it was meaningful work that allowed him to honor the trust those bobcats had placed in him by ensuring that other animals would benefit from improved practices. The conservation organization that Dr. Walsh had partnered with had established a small fund in honor of the bobcat rescue, supporting rapid response efforts for wildlife in crisis situations. The fund had already helped save several animals, from a young black bear that had become entangled in wire fencing to a family of river otters whose den had been threatened by erosion. Each rescue carried its own story, its own moment of crisis and resolution, but all of them traced their lineage back to that morning when Michael had heard the desperate cries of two bobcats and had chosen to respond rather than continue on his way. Michael's relationship with his community had subtly shifted as well. People who had known him for years now saw him differently, not just as the county maintenance worker, but as the man who had saved the bobcat cub. Children asked him questions about wildlife when they encountered him in town. Neighbors sought his advice when they had wildlife conflicts on their properties. He had become, without seeking the role, an ambassador for coexistence between humans and the wild creatures that lived among them. It was a responsibility he took seriously, always emphasizing respect and caution while encouraging appreciation and protection. As evening approached and Michael drove home from the anniversary visit to the clearing, he reflected on how profoundly that single morning had altered the trajectory of his life. He had not set out that day seeking adventure or looking to become involved in wildlife conservation. He had simply been driving to work, had heard sounds that troubled him, and had investigated. The decisions that followed, to approach the bobcats rather than flee, to attempt the rescue rather than call authorities and wait, to trust his instincts about what those wild animals needed, had all been made in the moment without time for deep contemplation. Yet looking back now, Michael understood that those decisions, made in the heat of the moment, had been informed by decades of experience working outdoors, of observing wildlife, of developing an intuitive understanding of animal behavior. He had not been reckless that morning. He had been prepared, equipped with both practical skills and emotional intelligence to recognize a crisis and respond appropriately. The rescue had not been luck or coincidence, but rather the convergence of preparation, opportunity, and a willingness to act when action was needed. 3 years to the day after the rescue, Michael returned to the clearing one more time, this time alone. He had not planned the visit as any kind of anniversary pilgrimage, but his work had brought him to the area, and he found himself drawn to the spot as if by magnetic pull. The morning was cool and misty, with fog hanging in the low places and moisture beading on every surface. The filled excavation was now completely invisible, reclaimed so thoroughly by nature that even someone who knew the history would struggle to identify where it had been. Michael sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, simply being present in the space, letting the sounds of the awakening forest wash over him. Birds called from the canopy above, announcing territories and seeking mates. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered against a tree trunk with mechanical precision. Small mammals rustled through the undergrowth, going about their business of survival. This was the real legacy of that morning 3 years ago. Not the documentary or the research papers or the conservation policies, though all of those mattered. The real legacy was this thriving ecosystem, continuing its ancient cycles with one more bobcat added to its ledger, one more life preserved to contribute to the intricate web of predator and prey, parent and offspring, individual and population. As Michael sat in contemplation, the fog began to lift, morning sunlight filtering through the dissipating mist in golden shafts that illuminated the clearing like a cathedral. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, movement at the tree line caught his attention. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat as a bobcat emerged from the shadows. It was an adult, powerfully built, and moving with the fluid grace that characterized the species. The cat paused at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet from where Michael sat motionless on his log. For a long moment, human and bobcat regarded each other across that distance. Michael could see the distinctive spotted pattern on the cat's coat, the tufted ears alert and forward, the golden eyes that assessed him with intelligent wariness. He could not know if this was one of the bobcats from that desperate morning. The markings seemed familiar, but memory was an imperfect thing, and he had learned enough about bobcats over the past 3 years to know that individual identification was challenging, even for experts without clear photographs for comparison. But then the bobcat did something unexpected. Instead of immediately retreating into the forest, as would be typical behavior upon encountering a human, it sat down. The gesture was deliberate, the cat lowering its haunches to the ground while maintaining eye contact with Michael. It was not aggressive posturing, nor was it fear. If Michael had to put a name to what he saw in that moment, he would have called it Acknowledgement. The bobcat seemed to be saying that it knew him, or if not him specifically, then what he represented. A human who meant no harm, who understood the unspoken rules of coexistence that allowed wild creatures and people to share the same landscape. They remained like that for perhaps 2 minutes, though time seemed to lose its normal meaning in the charged atmosphere of the clearing. Michael barely breathed, afraid that any movement would break the spell. The bobcat yawned, showing impressive canines, then stood and stretched in the way that cats of all sizes do, extending its front legs and arching its back. Then, without apparent concern or hurry, it turned and walked back into the forest, its spotted coat blending seamlessly with the dappled shadows until it simply vanished from sight. Michael sat for a long time after the bobcat disappeared, processing what he had just experienced. He had no way to prove it, no photographs or witnesses to verify the encounter, but in his heart, he felt certain that he had just had a final conversation with one of the bobcats from that morning 3 years ago. Whether it was the mother, the father, or even the cub now grown to adulthood, he could not say. But the connection he had felt, that sense of mutual recognition and respect, suggested a conclusion to the story that no documentary or research paper could provide. As he finally stood to leave, Michael noticed something at the base of a nearby tree. Fresh scat, clearly from a bobcat and very recent given its condition. Next to it, pressed into the soft earth, were several clear paw prints. Michael knelt to examine them, his trained eye reading the signs. A healthy adult bobcat had marked this territory within the past hour, possibly within the past few minutes. The animal he had just seen had left its calling card, a reminder that this forest belonged to the wild creatures first and foremost, and that humans were granted access only on terms of respect and careful stewardship. Michael pulled out his phone and took several photographs of the tracks and scat, documentation that he would add to the growing database of bobcat presence in the region. But more than scientific data, these images represented something personal and profound. They were evidence of continuity, of life persisting and thriving, of a story that had no real ending because the natural world did not deal in neat conclusions. The bobcats would continue to hunt and breed and raise their young in this forest long after Michael was gone, and perhaps somewhere in their collective memory, passed down through generations in ways humans did not yet understand. The story of a morning when a human helped rather than harmed would persist as well. Michael's phone buzzed with a text message from Maria, reminding him that they had plans that evening with friends. Normal life calling him back from this moment of connection with the wild. He responded quickly, confirming he would be home soon, then took one last look around the clearing. This place had become sacred to him in a way that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the sanctity of life, the importance of compassion, and the possibility of communication across the vast divide between species. As he walked back to his truck, Michael reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple decision to investigate unusual sounds on a spring morning 3 years ago. That decision had led him down paths he never could have anticipated, changing not just his own life, but contributing to broader conservation efforts that would benefit wildlife for generations to come. He had learned that individual actions mattered, that one person choosing to help could create ripples that extended far beyond the immediate moment, and that the capacity for trust and communication between humans and wild animals was greater than most people imagined. The story of the bobcat rescue would continue to be told, would continue to inspire others to pay attention to the natural world and to act when action was needed. But for Michael, the most important part of the story was not the dramatic rescue or the conservation work that followed. It was the quiet moments like the one he had just experienced, sitting in a misty clearing and sharing space with a wild creature that had chosen to acknowledge his presence rather than flee. Those moments, brief and unwitnessed by anyone else, were the true measure of success in the ongoing project of learning to coexist with the wild world that surrounded human civilization. As Michael drove away from the clearing for what he suspected might be the last time, he carried with him a sense of completion and gratitude. The Bobcat family had survived, the forest was healthier for their presence, and the relationship between humans and wildlife in his community had been strengthened by the lessons learned from one crisis overcome through courage, compassion, and trust. It was, he thought, as good a legacy as anyone could hope to leave, and it had all started with two desperate bobcats begging a brave savior to rescue their cub from a dangerous mud pit on an ordinary spring morning that had turned out to be anything but ordinary.